Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the Thriving for the Dissertation series. Tonight we have Publishing and Disseminating Your Research with Dr. Robert P. French II. And we are going to be learning about how he has been fortunate enough to not only publish a book, but 10 other journal articles. So we can't wait to learn from you. He's also an Eastern graduate he got his PhD in organizational leadership, and he was part of cohort 7.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Faith. I'm excited to talk tonight and share a little bit of what I've learned and also kind of the things that I would encourage anyone in that's interested in publishing. Um, you did a great job of introducing me. I really enjoy my time at Eastern. I've been fortunate enough to teach a little bit as well and find that through those experiences, the call or the exhortation to publish is something that we need to hear maybe a little bit more and a little bit more frequently. So I'm really excited to be able to share and hopefully to encourage you in publishing yourselves. So the first thing I'd talk about is just the importance of publishing and dissemination. Many of you are probably very aware at this point that you need to publish or you need to think about publishing. It's helpful not only after you start a career in the academy, but it's very helpful as you're beginning a career in the academy. It provides opportunities if you've published to have job opportunities, whether that's as an adjunct or as a associate, assistant, full-time professor. You're probably also very aware that to gain tenure, you need to demonstrate publications in a variety of ways, and the ways in which you're contributing not only to your subject matter expertise, but within the field of study that you are an expert in. I think most importantly to me as a follower of Christ, it's about calling. So most people that are at Eastern, maybe it's not pertinent to you, but most people identify some sort of sense of calling of why they're getting a PhD in organizational leadership. So if you feel at all called, whether it's to get a PhD or the PhD is simply something that will help you in your professional endeavors, um, I think that calling is really important to steward well. And it is a privileged position to be able to study not only at a graduate level, but at a doctoral level. So the work that you're doing right now, even if you don't intend to study beyond or continue to contribute to the academy in an academic sense, and you hope to do it more as a professional or as a kind of a scholar practitioner, I think it's really valuable to look at the work that you're doing now as work that might be able to be used by others to forward their own thinking, to refine the ways in which they're approaching a subject or a professional challenge, and to basically think about the papers and the projects that you're working at now and wondering how might I publish some of this? And is that stewarding what God has already given me and the opportunities that I have to be in this privileged position? So I often tell students, whether they're PhD students, THD students, or DMin students, that if you have the opportunity to publish and you're literally walking through a program right now, that you should try to find at least one paper, maybe multiple papers, maybe every course you try to publish. So it sounds like for cohort 16, you guys are at the tail end of your studies. However, if you're watching this and it's something that you're just beginning, I'd really encourage you to try to figure out how to make a publishable paper from at least one course each semester. That's something that I did as a student, and it worked out very well. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the ways in which you can do that. Some of the benefits of publishing that are not often talked about, but I believe are just really practically useful, is as you teach, many of us, if you're getting a PhD, have a hope to teach at some level within the academy. As you teach, it's incredibly handy to have published as you're lecturing or as you're talking. So if you're, developing a lecture or some sort of interaction with students around a subject matter, if you've published on the topic, you can cite yourself. which sounds really pompous and maybe a little self-serving, but it saves so much time. You don't have to go back and find the five scholars that already said something. You can go back and cite yourself and just demonstrate that you have an expertise on the topic. It's helpful. It also points people to an expertise that you have that someone else is recognizing, and that in and of itself can be very useful. The second thing is for your future writing or publications that you want to be part of. As you publish, it's actually beneficial that you cite yourself appropriately as long as the topic permits it. It helps to demonstrate that you have an expertise and a foundational working knowledge of an area. Um, and it's also very helpful as you're moving forward. The more that you do something, as you learn it, you become more and more efficient. And so publishing becomes easier. It's still challenging, but it becomes easier to do so. So I think it's also very helpful for your future writing and research. If you're looking to find support for your research and you have a publishing record on the subject matter, I would imagine that it would be advantageous considering any sorts of financial support that you might receive or institutional support, or even galvanizing other scholars to participate in the project that you're interested in, demonstrating that you have already been published and other scholars or experts in the field find value in your work or find it rigorous enough to be published, uh, helps give credence and credibility to you as a scholar. So there are several types of academic publications, and we talked here just a second ago, and Faith mentioned finding the right place for the articles that she's been working at and publishing, which is absolutely imperative and really important. And it's kind of an art more than a science. It's getting to know how things work within the publishing sector, within the scholarly publishing sector, and figuring out what you've written and how it might best be not only presented, but where it might fit. The kind of one of the most impressive sometimes is a monograph, which simply means that you're writing a book yourself. It can include empirical research, it can be a conceptual piece. It depends entirely on what you want to do. For example, if you publish your dissertation, that's considered a monograph. The next would be book chapters, some sort of edited scholarly book in which you are contributing or multiple people are contributing book chapters, and you might be one. This is a really great way to find space within the subject matter, especially if you have a really solid foundation within that um, subject area. They often will call for proposals or, sorry, submissions to propose books, and they'll ask for a variety of scholars to speak to some subject matter. And it's worth looking at. So if you have a subject matter expertise in transformational leadership, it's the example I love to use because everyone in organizational leadership seems to know something about transformational leadership. But if that is the call and they're asking for a specific vantage point or perspective, and it just so happens that you have something that can contribute or add potentially significantly, it's worth filling out the proposal. It's worth creating the proposal and seeing and having the conversation. I think book chapters have their own kind of essence in and of themselves of how they're written. And they can be very powerful tools to disseminate your ideas, communicate them to other scholars, and engage and influence the scholarly conversation. Conference, whether it's presentations, sometimes there's conference papers. There's a variety of things that happen at conferences. It sounds like ILA is at the doorstep, so many of you are well aware of this at this point. But conference proceedings are a great way to get your um, information out there and to share with others and get feedback, which is part of the benefit, I think, of conferences or speaking in some sort of lecture series if you're invited, or you see something at a university. Many universities do that where they'll invite speakers in a subject matter area from around the world, especially the bigger universities. This is a great way to share a paper that you're working at and receive feedback, critical and encouraging, hopefully. Also, conference publications or proceedings are usually fairly easy to be accepted for. There's not as much rigor. It's more of a roundtable of ideas. It doesn't mean that there isn't any sort of a vetting that happens. It just is a good entryway. It's a good place to start. And finally, peer-reviewed journals. And I should mention there's also non-peer-reviewed journals that are academic or considered scholarly. They don't have the same sort of rigor, and they're not considered or valued quite as highly as peer-reviewed. However, they are there, and it can be a really great entryway. But we'll just say journals, broadly speaking. And within journals, there are 5 different types of articles. You're probably aware of this through research methods in the courses you've taken there, but if not, I like to remind people of these 5 different types of articles because it's really helpful to categorize and simplify what not only what you have for publishing, but as you're analyzing and reviewing literature and trying to understand what someone has offered and how it might influence your thinking. The first are editorials. As you may know, editorials really are an opinion piece. Typically, they're an opinion piece based upon expertise, either as an academic or as a practitioner. For example, Burns was asked to do editorial pieces on transformational leadership or on a variety of things. Um, the point here is not necessarily to regurgitate or to communicate research, empirical data and analysis, conceptual work, or literature. It's really to provide some sort of insight into a facet of a topic that the editors of the journal are interested in. So, for example, I did spend some time working with Dr. Chang at the International Journal of Multicultural Education. And if we had a special issue, there might have been an opportunity for an editorial in which they would invite a scholar who is an expert on that specific topic within multicultural education. And they would ask that person either openly to write something about the topic, maybe to write about the transformation of the topic, the progression of the topic, the development of the topic, maybe the challenges or critique, whatever it might be, the state of the research, it could be anything. And then that person would really write in a piece based upon their expertise. It's still reviewed, it's still worked through with the editors of the journal. However, it's a piece that often is um, asked for because of a prior expertise. Book reviews. Book reviews are like the easiest way to publish. That's a really great way to start publishing, especially if you're already reading, which again, if you're in your third year, this might not be helpful. But as you work at your dissertation, perhaps you read a book that's relatively new. Typically, book reviews are very new pieces of new monographs, new edited books on a topic that could be of potential interest for the readers of that journal. And so a book review is usually very, very short. If you've already read the book, figuring out how to present an analysis of it within the confines and kind of rules for a book review is a really great way to publish and to start publishing. The final 3 are conceptual pieces, literature reviews, and research, empirical research. Conceptual pieces are just what they sound. They're ideas. It's when someone engages theoretical ideas within a topic. They are, in some ways, in my opinion, some of the most influential pieces that we should be reading as doctors of philosophy. And in other ways, they're kind of the most challenging because they can be all over the place. A literature review, you've written literature reviews, you've played with literature reviews, you're going to keep writing literature reviews, your dissertation's on the horizon, so you'll be working at a massive literature review. This is a paper that specifically reviews literature and provides some sort of insight or analysis or critique on a subject that should forward the conversation for scholars that are interested in the topic. And then finally, research. And we all know there's 3 broad categories, qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method. So these are the 5 different types of articles. Part of understanding why those 5 articles are necessary is to kind of understand what journals are publishing and why they're publishing those things. So each journal usually has a page on their website that talks about scope. And scope is really what the journal wants to publish or how they want to influence. So the types of articles they want to publish and influence, types of research. Some journals only want to, they predominantly are interested in conceptual pieces. Some journals are only interested in empirical study. Some journals do not do book reviews, for example. in the scope, it'll often talk about those things. So again, to go back to the experience with Dr. Chang, uh, that journal was only interested in publishing qualitative research. So, and specifically qualitative research on multicultural education. And so if you had qualitative research that was about education in one context, probably your article will not be even considered beyond a cursory look. I can tell you that in my 3 years working with Dr. Chang, or 2 years, 2 or 3 years, I can't remember how long I worked with her on the journal. Um, we would receive several articles every year that were quantitative, and it's kind of interesting when you think about it. It's very clearly stated, this is what we accept, and yet still people were attempting because of the topic to publish journal articles or at least get us to consider publishing journal articles. That's a really quick way to get rejected quickly. So if you're interested in getting rejected quickly, look at the scope and do exactly the opposite of what they say. You need to look at the scope, pay attention to the what they want to publish and why. If you think there should be some sort of exception, like you're right on the cusp of something, like let's say you have a mixed method study that's predominantly quantitative and not qualitative. There's a little bit of qual in it, but not too much. But it's so thoroughly a multicultural education. And because of something else the journal has already published, you really think it would be a good fit. That's an appropriate time to email an editor and say, hey, this is the piece I have. I read your scope. This is the article. I realize it's a bit of a stretch. Would you be at all interested in considering it? And that way it kind of primes them to understand why you're thinking what you're thinking and maybe to give it some consideration. And they might tell you right up front, nope, we're not interested at all. Or hey, I'll take a look at it and let you know. Or yes, please submit it anyway. So scope is incredibly important as a potential author to understand what the journal publishes and why. Often, one of the easiest ways to pick journals is as you're working through your research, as you're reviewing literature, and you see that certain journals are being cited over and over again, multiple articles from certain journals. That's a really great way to say, hey, I should look at this journal because this journal is interested in my topic and my subject matter. So when you go to that journal, and even if the topic is correct, if the scope is somehow off, it's not worth continuing to pursue them as a potential publisher. The audience is also something that a journal will identify, which is very helpful. So if your work, whatever your article is, your submission, that you're interested in getting out there for other people to read, you need to know what your audience is. You need to know, am I looking to influence leaders and practitioners? And I really want to change the way they think? Or am I really looking to influence scholars or something else? And then whatever that is, you want to make sure that when you're looking for a journal, your interests align. I know that sounds really straightforward and easy, but there are hundreds and hundreds of journals, thousands and thousands of journals. I'm sure in your subject matter, you'll be able to find many different potential opportunities. So these are some ways that they will also work to whittle out submissions that are not appropriate for them or they're not interested in, but it's also helpful for you to do so because if you publish a piece and it's predominantly a practitioner's journal and you're not interested in influencing practice, at least on that end of it, it'd be very disappointing to publish it. You only get to publish something once. You really can't publish it with one journal and then turn around and submit it and publish it with another journal. It's considered unethical, and it will be a problem for you if you are discovered for doing that. Impact factor is how often an article is cited, usually over a very certain time frame. There's a variety of critiques about impact factor being how important of a metric it is. However, journals do cite or point to impact factor as a reason for their ranking or why they are top tier or where they are um, in reference to others. Generally speaking, journals are ranked. There are journals that are more selective than others or are considered to be the pinnacle of the field. So, for example, in our area of study, leadership is one of the best journals to get published in. It's very difficult to be published in that journal. Um, However, that does not mean it's the best journal necessarily. It might be a really great journal in lots of ways, but perhaps for some specific conceptual idea that you have or that you're interested in, or perhaps as it pertains to a specific type of research or subject matter, maybe leadership isn't the right journal or the best journal. So I think one of the things that you learn as you start looking at journals is figuring out how journals understand themselves, how they're ranked and viewed within the subject matter, and what you're interested in being associated with part of. Generally speaking, it's pretty difficult to get published. It again depends, but in peer-reviewed journals, and the statistics change a little bit, but it's around 12%, 10, 12, maybe up to 20, depending on the journal percent acceptance rate, which means that you have to kind of be willing to be rejected as you start publishing and as you try. Um, with journals, there are open access and there are traditional open access. Typically, you pay up front in some way, shape, or form to have your article published. And the premise here is that the author paying enables the journal to go through the processes they need to go through without relying upon uh, advertising or some sort of support from an institution. There are blended models in this as well, where you can have a traditional publisher. Some of the big journals now are doing this. I think Emerald is one, Sage is another. Not only do they have open access journals where the whole journal is open access, but even in some of their premier uh, journals, you can pay as the author after your article is accepted to have your article become open access. The benefit of open access is that many more people will see your article. So let's say Emerald, for example. To look at an article through Emerald, you need to have some sort of access through an institution, a library, etc. It can be very difficult, or then you have to pay for individual access. So if you Google a topic, whether it's Google Scholar or you just put it into Google more broadly, and you find an article that you think just really would be awesome to read for your subject matter, or you're just curious about a topic, and you don't have access to that article, it can stop you from looking at the article. Whereas if you pay for open access, anyone that Googles the article can read it and read it just by clicking a button. So you'll have many, many more people. I have at least one article that I can think of off the top of my head that isn't in an open access journal and thousands of views. It's quite interesting. However, it has not been cited as much as some of the other articles that I published, even though it's in a Sage publication and it's a reputable journal. Um, Another thing that should be mentioned is the opportunity, depending on the journal, for citing. You want your articles to be cited and you want your work to be interacted with. And so that's important. We can talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Traditional publishing typically has some sort of funding source. Again, university money, grants, can be advertising. But the idea here is that there's something that is basically paying for the mechanism of the whole publishing thing. It takes a lot of time to create one issue in a journal. You're talking editors, it's just a lot of time. And that could be access through libraries. They sell access to libraries, these journals like Sage, Emerald, etc. So these are traditional publishing models. Um, and uh, there's nothing wrong with that model. It's just two different approaches at this point. Open access is a much newer approach. And as I said, there is a hybrid. I think the challenge with all of this when you're trying to figure out how to select a journal is balancing quality as well as the contribution of what you're offering of your submission. So, for example, if you have a piece that you've written and it's a good piece, but you realize it's not the journal of leadership quality, then it's really kind of foolish to submit it to leadership. It would make much more sense to submit it to a lower journal, maybe a professional journal, that kind of mix. Maybe it's not even peer reviewed, maybe it is. Um, but to know what you have so that you can find the right home for it. If it's an academic piece, you don't want to submit it to anything other than a scholarly journal that's peer reviewed because you have something that's of value and that you want to engage and have that the scholars in that area potentially interact with and respond to your work. But I encourage people. I think it's something that I found that's helpful is the more that you play in the sandbox, the more you'll realize what you have and where the quality of what you have might fit. And that doesn't mean that I'm saying don't aim high. I think you should aim as high as you can. In fact, maybe a little higher than what you think you actually have, because you can always be rejected by someone and submit it subsequently to a lesser journal. Um, I had a thought there and it escaped me in the moment. But finding the right journal and ensuring that you're getting the right quality for your submission is important. Because, and many of you might know this, you might not know this, but when you create a submission for a journal, you are not able to submit that article to other journals for their consideration. So you have to wait for that journal to make a decision. Journal decisions can be very slow. And you want it to take time. If they immediately give you a decision, it's most likely a rejection. Most of the time, it takes months to hear something back from a quality, reputable journal because the process itself, which we'll talk about in a minute or two, takes time. So you are kind of betrothed in a way to that journal until they reject you or accept your work. So you need to make good decisions about where you're submitting your work to. Otherwise, you're tying up a piece for potentially weeks, months. You can always, take your submission back and say, "Hey, I'm no longer interested in publishing with you." But if journals find out that you're submitting the same piece to two places, they will be upset. And most journals at this point have some sort of form that you will consent to that says I have not submitted this to any other journals or any other publishers. So it's important to have a good idea of what the quality of your submission is and to find the right place, the best place that you think you can. A wonderful way to do that is to rely upon people that you know that have published or people that are experts. So one of my favorite things about the faculty at Eastern are they are incredibly useful. They have so much knowledge and information, and they are so friendly. And so you can ask anyone that is a teacher there, hey, I have this piece. I'm thinking about publishing it. I'm considering this journal or this journal. Uh, would you be able to just give me an idea of what would you do with it? Or, let them read it, give you feedback in addition to that. But having other people give um, just more insights into how you can improve or how you might be able to see your work will be really beneficial. One of the best things for me, and I will continue to speak glowingly about Hiwan, hopefully for the rest of my life, is when you have someone that will work with you and teach you the process. And Hiwan was kind enough to walk with me and teach me not only on individual submissions, but more broadly as I worked with her with the journal. So finding a faculty member or someone that's published quite a bit and asking them questions, being able to send them an email, having a conversation with them, taking them to lunch, taking them to coffee, whatever it might be, so that you can learn and try to figure out what you have and the quality of your pieces. Very helpful. The other thing you can do is if you you have a paper that you received feedback from a professor, it was for a course, you can always email that professor and say, hey, I'm thinking about getting this published. Do you have any insights or anything that you'd ask me to clean up or change with the insight that I will be editing and reviewing this with the hopes of submitting it for publication. There are also predatory journals, which are just what they sound like. They are journals that are trying to get money from you. Um, how to avoid them is uh, pretty interesting. It's kind of like when someone sends you an email and they say your long lost uncle from Switzerland just died and you're a multimillionaire and all you need to do is send your social security number and we will get all his money to you as quickly as possible. Well, that sounds really good and it would be really great if that happened, but most of us can figure out that that's not probably a viable path. Similarly, predatory journals will often send emails or they'll somehow contact you or publishers and they'll be asking you for things or offering you things that don't really make sense based upon what you've done thus far. And the more that you spend time publishing and thinking about publishing, the more you'll be able to look at and recognize by name value whether a publisher is legitimate or not. And the other thing you can do is research it. Just type into Google, is this journal predatory, or reviews of this journal, whatever the journal is or publisher is that is you're potentially worried about. And that will help. Another method is community. Talk with other people that are in the field and say, hey, have you heard of this journal? I've been contacted by editor so and so from blah, 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 and they are interested in publishing my work and they're asking for this much money for an open access. You don't have to give them all the details, but do you know anything about them? Are they reputable? What's their have you interacted with them in the past? And other people in the community will also be a helpful tool to ensure that you're not caught up in something that you shouldn't be. Good. I'm gonna stop there just so I can take a drink of my tea. I know there's only two of you, but are there any questions at this point?
I like your advice, Rob, to use every term, every course as a potential opportunity to submit an article to a publication. And you pointed out something that we found that our instructors at Eastern are very helpful in providing feedback and helping you get to that point of publication. And so I would imagine then that it is not necessarily uh, an extremely convoluted or complicated process to take work that you've already done and create something that can be, potentially submitted. And obviously, as you pointed out, also, you will be mindful of the guidelines that are created by that particular publication.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, it's very insightful. And the more you do this, the more you will write with an eye towards what you want the outcome to be. So even if you have a paper for a professor and you know you want to write basically a journal article, um, you will start formatting, structuring, organizing based upon the best practices of publishing in journals, and it will work for your professors. The more you do that, the more you'll write just with an expertise that carries through and translates well. So yeah, absolutely. That's that's true. And you'll find that if I and I won't tell you which professor I did this to, but I asked a professor if I could slightly alter an assignment. I wrote a paper and the professor wrote back and said, "This is a wonderful paper. Nothing to do with the assignment and nothing to do with the course, but a wonderful paper." And I was able just to take that with the feedback that was given and publish it within months without much editing because I'd been working that way. I'd been working to do that. And yeah, and I appreciated it, the feedback. But yeah, if you get a paperback and you have a really great mark on it, and I realized there's trying to say this as nicely as possible. There's an inflation of grades at the doctoral level where um, a lot of high marks are given that don't necessarily reflect an expertise or an excellent production of writing or ideas. So you have to be able to sort through that a little bit.
Mhm.
So just because you get an A on a paper doesn't mean you should publish it, is another way of saying that. I'll just say it more bluntly. But if a professor gives you some really good feedback and they're saying, "Hey, this is excellent. This is really good," that would, if I was a student, that would cue me into like I should publish this one. This one needs to find a home somewhere, and then work through it. And I will also add that if you're going to publish, one of the costs is a willingness to edit and revise. It's almost like a commitment to like, I'm going to get this piece published. I'm going to work until I get it published. And so that means you have to be willing to work at it and keep working at it. Good. So let's talk about preparing your manuscript. That's great. Um, Laurel, you did a great job of serving not only as a great question for me to give me a feedback to give a drink of tea or two, but also like a perfect transition. So well done.
Great.
Yeah. So whenever you're preparing a manuscript or whenever you're, thinking about submitting, essentially, going back to the scope, you need to understand the journal's guidelines and their requirements. If the requirements are APA, guess what your submission should be in? APA. Not brilliant, like it's not rocket science. This isn't hard, But a lot of people are so kind of rushed. They don't want to spend the time up front. And so they'll just kind of go through the motions and they'll just submit stuff and they'll hope that it passes through. It won't. If it's a reputable journal, it'll get kicked out really quick. We'll talk a minute about how that process works. So whatever the guidelines are, whether it's referencing, whether it's how you do abbreviations, whether it's formatting of paragraphs and tabs, as mundane as that might seem, you don't want to give a potential publisher any reason to reject your submission. You want to have everything there as best you can. It's very similar to when you write papers for your professors in your classes. Your paper should be the best that you could possibly produce at that point. As a professor at a doctoral level, I tell students this all the time. You do not want your professors to be worrying about whether you put a period in the right place or you punctuated, some other sentence or area correctly with a reference. You don't want them hung up on grammar. You want them to be able to read your ideas and give you feedback based upon your ideas. Because what they are an expert in, yes, they're an expert in referencing. Yes, they're an expert in grammar. Yes, they're an expert in writing. But what you want them to give you is their expertise in the subject matter, which there aren't many people that can do that. And they are one. You can find other people to give you expertise in referencing. You can find other people to give you expertise in grammar. But you want your paper so buttoned up that all they're focused on, all they're giving you feedback on, is your ideas on the topic, because that's really what's there. So when you submit an article, you want the article to be without errors. It follows the guidelines for whatever the journal wants, page numbers in the upper left corner or bottom right, whatever it is. Everything should just be buttoned up to a point where they're not focused on anything other than your ideas. And if that's there, that's really helpful because most journals have processes in place that they'll reject your submission if there are any sort of significant errors around their guidelines or their formatting requirements. I think another way to do this is to pay attention to the articles you read. We've mentioned Emerald, or I've mentioned Emerald and Sage. There are certain ways that these publishers format articles. You'll see a flow. So, for example, a quantitative empirical study that's published, let's say their requirement is a 20-page requirement and they say no more than 30. You'll see that when their quantitative pieces are published, their literature reviews are typically 1 to 4 pages. Don't submit an article with a 7-page literature review because obviously what they're focused on is focused probably more on communicating and discussing the data and the analysis of what you've done, or maybe the methodology. If the literature review is going to be that long, it needs to be substantiative where it makes sense. Like I'm bringing something to the table that's not just regurgitating what everyone else has already done. My literature review is actually contributing in such a way that it has to be in this piece and you need to publish it this way. So you get a sense of how to format or organize your work, your submission, based upon what that journal does. So pay attention to what you read, especially within your specialization. If you think something's super important, but no one else in your subject matter seems to think so, you need to figure out why. Because if it's not important, then why include it? It's just something that um, you might get rejected for. And remember, in peer review, the people that are most likely going to be reviewing your work, hopefully, the journal will find someone that's a subject matter expert in your subject matter. So if you are having, you're kind of already discussing things within the ways and organizing it in the ways and formatting in the ways that scholars within your topic do, it's a benefit. It just helps and it will help translate it well for them. Um, so pay attention to the articles you read, the specialization, etc. Read articles published by the journal. Look and observe the norms of what's typical. For example, again, Emerald, they tend to have a very interesting formatting in the beginning of their work where they kind of have like an outline of methodology and different things in the abstract portion so that you can quickly scan through and figure out what the article is about. Other journals don't do that. So if you want to publish with Emerald, you'll have to know that that's probably something you're going to need to do up front. It's just something that will be helpful for you. The process, and this might be a good place to talk about this, the process for the publishing, how a publisher in an academic journal goes through from submission to publication is as such. When you submit through a journal, most journals at this point have some sort of online interface where you're doing everything through a form. You're submitting it through the website. Once that submission is there, there's some sort of pre-screening that's done. That pre-screening basically is looking at the scope. Does the scope and the guidelines of the journal, is the submission following it? So for example, in my previous um, example that I shared, if it's a qualitative journal, they're only interested in publishing qualitative pieces. If someone reads the submission and it's a quantitative study of whatever, it's immediately going to be rejected. So from that point forward, you'll get a rejection. They'll send one out pretty quickly. But if it meets all those basic things, it will then go to an editor. The editor will typically review it quickly just to make sure that it's within the right area. There's nothing else glaring, maybe page length, maybe some other things. But just will review it really quickly. And they will then look to move it to peer review. When it goes to peer review, it's typically two peer reviewers, sometimes it's more, but it's usually blind, double blind peer review. The reviewer doesn't know your name, doesn't know where you're from. That's all stripped from the information. They are typically a subject matter expert, either broadly in the topic of the journal or hopefully within the methodology and or the specific topic. And editor or the editor team from the editorial team from the journal will start contacting individuals to ask them if they're interested in reviewing um, the piece. Peer reviewers don't get paid. It's something you do because you have a love for the topic or it's a service. Some institutions will ask, you can put in um, the feedback that you give your institution that you've served by reviewing articles for such and such journals. But there's no pay involved. So what typically happens is if I don't know if either of you have reviewed for journals before, what happens is you get an email from an editor and it says, "This is the journal article. We'd really like you to read it. They'll try to make it personalized in some way, shape, or form. And then they ask you if you want to review it or not, or if you'll review it. And you usually have two options essentially. You'll review it or you won't. So from the time that that email gets sent out, that can take a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months, depending on how quick the person is to respond to email. I don't know how many professors you've interacted with, but not all of them are great with email or very punctual, and things that are not really high priority sometimes don't get a lot of attention. So for the editorial team, they might send out two requests to two different peer reviewers, and they hear back from one immediately, and the other they don't hear back for 4 weeks or 2 weeks or something like that. But once they have their two reviewers, the reviewers then get a copy of the article and they review it. And they basically get to make recommendations. There's a variety of ways this happens. Sometimes it's pretty open-ended. But at this point, with most of the bigger journals, there are specific prompts that the reviewer is asked around a variety of things, the scope and impact, as well as potential contribution. And then grammar and referencing and all those detaily things. But the reviewer will give a recommendation of whether the article should be accepted, whether there needs to be revisions, or whether it should be rejected. Broadly speaking, there are 5 different outcomes that you can get. The first is accept without revisions, incredibly rare. The next is accept with revisions. That's probably what you want to aim for. The next is accept with major revisions, which essentially indicates that there will be some sort of additional review. The fourth is decline with the potential for resubmission, where they see potential, but it's too far off right now to promise anything. And the fifth is an outright rejection. So the reviewer will make a recommendation. Then once both reviews are back, an editor will get the reviews. They'll look at the reviews. They'll also often read the article or at least scan it, and they'll make a determination at that point of what they want to do, or they might bring in another editor on the team to have multiple people look at the article. If they're interested in moving forward with it in some way, shape, or form, some sort of revisions, they'll send back to the uh, author that submitted it and say, this is what our reviewers found. We'd like you to revise. They might give very specific instructions about which facets of the feedback that was given by reviewers they think is most pertinent, and they might also provide additional feedback. Or they might simply say, no, we're not interested. They will often, most journals will give you the information back. So even if you're rejected, you'll get back the comments of the two peer reviewers. You won't know who they are. You'll just see peer reviewer one, peer reviewer two. So that process, just to get to that point, if you think it, takes a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks for that first pre-screening, then another week, 2, 3, 4 weeks for that editor to send it out to whoever it needs to be sent out to. And then anywhere from a month, because typically peer reviewers are given a month to review an article and provide feedback. But it might take a month, it might take 2 months. It just depends. If one reviewer finishes and the other flakes out, then they have to find an additional peer reviewer. And in that process, then you're just adding time. So the process just to get to an initial decision through peer review can be several months. Once you have that decision, let's assume that it's not a rejection and there's some sort of revision, you do your revisions. Maybe that takes a couple weeks, maybe that takes a month or so, and then you resubmit. And then it's the process of just waiting for the editors to get back to you. Once the article is submitted for publication or accepted, sorry, the submission is accepted for publication, then there'll be a variety of kind of proofreading, layout editing kinds of steps. And those go relatively quickly and usually are contingent upon the publication schedule for the journal. So if the journal publishes quarterly, it seems like they ramp up as they get closer. Some have rolling. It just depends on how they particularly do it. So from beginning to end, the process in a high quality, peer reviewed academic journal typically takes months, uh, anywhere from 4 months to a year. Can take longer. It just depends on the journal and how they operate. There are other journals that aren't nearly run as efficiently for a variety of reasons. And it can take longer. It can be shorter. It just depends. But that's the process overall. Any questions about the process that journals use for publishing, the publishing process within academic journals? Good. All right. So just as some tips as you continue to write or think about publishing, I think we have an idea that writing is an inherent skill or characteristic, and whatever you have, you pretty much have. So if you're good at writing, you're a good writer. And if you're not good at writing, you're not a good writer. I think it's probably the wrong way of looking at it. I think the best way of looking at it is no matter how good or how poor of a writer you are, that we need to be continual learners, which is not in any way groundbreaking or magical. But I think sometimes we get to the place where as we're, at this level of education, and even if we've had a few things published, we think we've kind of learned how to write. I think the better way of thinking about it is like, no, I'm still learning. Like I'm always learning how to write. I'm always learning how to use grammar more effectively. I'm always learning how to use my voice in a way that is more reflective of not only who I am, but is effective within the context of the publication or audience in which I'm trying to reach. I'm always trying to learn how to write more effectively and efficiently. And if you have that mentality, as you hear feedback and as you receive feedback through the publishing process, it'll be really helpful. I mentioned that the rejection rate is really high. The acceptance rate is really low. So one of the cost, not only of time, it costs time to publish, but it also costs a willingness to be rejected. And that's difficult. It's really difficult to hear that your ideas aren't good or to have someone push back on something that you thought was the best part that you had, or to hear someone critique your writing or something that you really value about your writing or your voice. And so it's hard to be rejected and it's costly to be rejected, but it's part of the process of writing and part of the process of academic writing. Um, Proper citations and referencing are absolutely imperative. If you don't use referencing software and you're interested in publishing, I'd highly recommend you start using referencing software. It makes everything a whole lot easier. So if you play in one sandbox all the time as far as referencing goes, and you're always writing an APA, well, that's great. That's wonderful. Then you'll never have to move to another format. However, if you publish in something other than APA, which a lot of people do, and many disciplines don't use APA, then being able to translate that very quickly is not only beneficial, it's necessary. There is referencing software out there that, let's say you write a paper, you have it all buttoned up in APA, and you now have an opportunity to submit something that's in Chicago. There's referencing software that just by clicking on the drop-down menu, you can change the whole thing just by clicking and changing it. And that's really, really helpful. I know Word seems to do that, but at least to my knowledge, it was not very effective in times past. And by referencing style, that does not just mean the referencing spaces and where the authors go and where the year goes, all of that. It also means the formatting of the paper itself, which is very helpful. The other thing about referencing software is it's really helpful to stay organized. The more you read, the more difficult it is to keep all your ideas together and to make sure you know where things are coming from and who they belong to. Referencing software can help with that. I think as you continue forward and as you get feedback, figuring out how to respond to people, whether it's reviewers' comments or it's editors, is challenging. I don't have the best insights there. I think having a posture of humility, and it's almost the same to me as a dissertation defense. You have to know when to just accept what's being said, as well as when to stand up for what you believe to be true and is a non-negotiable. There are times where there'll just be differences of opinion and you have to move forward. But either way, even if there's differences of opinion, let's say someone has a very um, strong reaction to an idea that you've shared and you've received that feedback, even if you can't work with that person beyond that, it's beneficial to learn why the reaction is so strong and maybe how you can more effectively couch or position your argument to have that conversation with someone that is coming from that position or vantage point. So learning how to respond with reviewers and editors is really important. And it's something that I think is as much of an art of relationship as it is anything that I could give you as far as do this or don't do that. Just a few other thoughts really quickly before we wrap up. You should try to get your workout in any way that you can. You've probably seen that some of the faculty members at Eastern put it in their signature line if they publish something. That's one way to do it. Social media is another option. Obviously, with social media being the way that it is, it makes sense to learn how to use that as effectively as possible to get your ideas out there as well as share your published work. Doing that well and doing it in a way where it doesn't feel like you're pushing what you've done down other people's throat is really cool to watch people do that well. I'm not sure that I'm the best person to talk about the use of social media effectively, but I think it's something to pay attention to and learn from, especially for professional pieces or that nexus between scholarly and practice are really important. I do want to talk just a little bit about ethical considerations because this is really important. Um, whenever you write something, if you published it someplace, you can't publish it again. It's the same reason that you can't write a paper for one course and then use that same paper for another course. The idea is that you're writing something new and authentic that's just for that specific context. There are scholars that publish a piece in one journal and then try to publish it again in a second journal. And the reason they're doing that is because they're trying to bolster their publication record. They'll often change the title, they'll make it look a little different, but when you actually read it, it's very telling. It's very telling. I think that's becoming less common at this point because of software and computer and technology. However, it's still something to be attentive to. You also shouldn't take credit for something you haven't written. So that kind of gets tricky. If you bring on someone as a second author, which is a very popular um, method within the academy. For example, if you write a paper and some big name in the field is like, I really like some of what you're doing here. Would you like to work? But you've already written a second paper and they come on as they'll agree to work with you and they'll come on as a second author. So they haven't written the article, but they've come on as a second author. It's important to give them the credit, especially if you agree together to have that sort of um, uh, you're identifying their contribution through that way. Yeah, Laurel.
I would Imagine also that you could give the article a slightly different spin or focus. So if you conducted a study on, I'm looking at on virtual communities of faith, then maybe in a second article submission, you could take a look at virtual communities of interest and speak about it more broadly. I would,
Mhm.
well, I would think that even just the slightest spin could make it a genuine new article.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely true. And you could
Oh,
do even just a bigger research project. I've seen people do this where they have a dissertation, for example, or a project they've been working on for years, and they'll publish one article that's a literature review, and then they'll publish a subsequent article that's basically the empirical facet. They still have a smaller literature review, much, much smaller, but they're using the literature review and what they found in one section, one idea, and doing something over here. That makes sense as well. Absolutely. Or you might take, maybe you do an empirical article and you're really speaking to, data collection analysis and the implications of your findings. And then you write a subsequent piece that's like a professional, practical kind of thing where you're still kind of digging into that a little bit, but it's not to regurgitate it. It's really to speak to another audience and present it in a different way. So yeah, that makes absolute sense, Laura.
so I have a question in reference to speaking at conferences
Mhm.
or, and then also like publishing. Is that a conflict?
No, it shouldn't be.
How do you make sure the conference isn't publishing papers from that? Is that a normal occurrence?
No, typically when at least my understanding, typically when a conference publishes papers, you'll be well aware that they're going to publish your paper. But I think you just say, if you're speaking on something, I'm working on something here, it also helps plug your work, or I have an article coming out here on this topic. It's in press, is the fun way of saying that. Or I have an article that I'm looking for the right home for, something like that. Well, you can do that kind of thing, and that way too, people that are listening might be interested enough to reach out to you, and especially if it's a subject matter expert or a peer in that area, they might reach out to you and say, "Hey, I'd love to read it and give you feedback," and that's gold. If you can get someone to give you feedback before you submit it or in the process, that's wonderful. I've had people reach out to me and I've done this with other people as well, and they've because of subject matter, and they'll send me a paper and say, "Would you read this and give me feedback before I submit it?" Sure, yeah, absolutely. And it's usually because they've cited me and they want to know, how does this sound to you, etc. And I can say, "Hey, I would change this, I'd change that," give some positive reinforcement. So no, I don't think so. I don't think that's a conflict of interest. I think if you say, "Hey, I have novel research that no one's ever seen before. I've never done any work. I'm just thinking about this off the top of my head," and then someone finds out you've already published a paper on the topic, that's a different ball of wax. So conflicts of interest are also important. If you have some sort of vested interest and you're publishing or presenting information that is a conflict to that interest, it's important to recognize that. It's important to own it and to be transparent in it. And then this one is the big one, plagiarism and self-plagiarism. So self-plagiarism is when you use your own work again without recognizing that you published it somewhere else, which as students, you might have run into this already, within your coursework. Maybe you haven't. But if you've written a paper for semester one course run, and then you take several paragraphs of that paper and use it without changing it for course five, year two, that's a problem. Self-plagiarism. The same is true if you self-plagiarize work that you've published. So think about this for a second. If you write something, you really like it, you've published it, and it's like a couple paragraphs, maybe a couple sentences, and then you just use it again a few months later, submit it to a different journal for a different paper, you're plagiarizing yourself. You're taking your own ideas and you're not recognizing that they came from somewhere else. The reason it's a problem isn't because it's your own ideas, it's the integrity of your own work as well as honoring the publisher that already produced your work. So one way to deal with that is simply to recognize these sentences have been used before. You can use, well, not in APA, you can't use a footnote, but in many many other referencing styles, you could use a footnote and say that. In APA, you could just cite yourself that way. Or you could just rewrite it. It's not that big of a deal to rewrite. One of the issues that I'm finding more and more and I didn't realize it was such a big deal, even though I think I had people tell me it was, is plagiarism in general among scholars. So understanding what is and what isn't plagiarism is important. And broadly speaking, plagiarism is taking anyone else's ideas and using them as your own, correct? Like that's, we can agree to that. So if you get an idea, if Laurel reads Faith's paper that Faith has published in whichever journal she's published, and Laurel's work doesn't really give Faith credit for the ideas. And it almost seems like Laurel's ideas are the same as Faith's ideas, but really Laurel's ideas all come from Faith's framework, her concepts, etc. It's plagiarism. And that gets to be really problematic. It's difficult to detect because it's not word for word. You're not copying a whole sentence and putting it. Software can do that. But if you're getting ideas from somewhere else, you need to correctly recognize where they come from. So if you read a literature review and someone has done a great job synthesizing and analyzing the literature in your topic. And let's say they've come up with a categorization of 5 different errors of how this topic has uh, been transformed over the first 10 years, the second 10 years, the third 10 years, etc. And then you use that exact same framework in your paper. If you don't cite that person and say, I'm using the framework by Laurel, that's plagiarism. It's a form of it. And so any idea that doesn't come from yourself, you need to cite, which means you need to have really good organizational skills or memory skills, whatever's appropriate. But give people credit where credit is due and make sure that even if you're using other people's ideas, you're using them in such a way that it's evident to the reader where your ideas begin and their ideas end. And just to end with this, I've talked predominantly about academic writing, and I think that's probably appropriate given the um, what I was asked to do and the name of this lecture. But don't forget about professional writing. Don't forget about the tier below academic writing. There are opportunities to publish in professional journals or professional publications. Um, Consider doing it. It doesn't have to be the first thing you do, but consider doing it because the nexus between academic and practical is important. And oftentimes, a lot of people, especially in our program in organizational leadership, are looking to ultimately make a change in the way people uh, lead and follow and the way organizations are effective. So don't forgo or think less of those things. They're still important. They still matter. They're still great fodder on the CV. I think they still help for academic positions. And more than anything else, it's a way, again, to steward the opportunity that God has provided for you. I think that's what I have. So are there any questions that you either of you have tonight?
Laura?
No, I think I've inserted quite a few.
Yeah, thank you for your input.
No, I think we're good.
Good. Kept it close to an hour. That's a benefit.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. It was so informative. Um,
Yes.
I am gonna turn off the recording and then ask you one other question, but